You made a face the first time she said it in front of you, something pale and thick that had no business smelling that good. And she just waited, arms crossed, until you tasted it. She was never wrong. Here are 60 disgusting Depression-era foods that actually taste amazing. In the same way people would reuse their leftovers, people would cut trips to the doctor as much as they could. It was simple. A lot of the time, the doctor's advice just was not something you could apply in real life. They would tell you to give consultation fees, then ask you to buy 3 pills and syrups that you aren't even sure will work or not. Honestly, I don't think they're sure either. People would end up using things like chicken soup to cure colds, flu, and other kinds of basic issues. This is another reason why people really wanted to save their meat too. Instead of just wasting it on a day when you really miss the taste of chicken or beef, it was better to save it for when people in the household inevitably fell sick and need something like an actual beef stew. Lemons, when they couldn't be used for cleaning in the house, were used for things like sore throats and in place of cough syrup. The trick was to use lemon and mix it in with warm water and honey. This actually does work, so kudos to them. It's even believed by doctors to help relieve any discomfort in the throat. Lemon was used also because it had a lot of vitamin C in it, and that helped people boost the strength of their immune system. The less sick you got, the better it was for your funds. Another thing that got really popular was the entire concept of canned food. This was something industries would cash in on like an African gold mine later on in America's history and people's lives, but it made its debut on the grand stage here. During the Depression, canned food had become a lifesaver for so many different kinds of reasons. It was easy to preserve, which was the biggest one. This was always the kind of thing you would get for long trips, journeys where you'd go days without seeing stores, or for times like these. The stuff in those cans was built to last for months, and so were the cans. It also meant that people were able to get things pre-cut and made for them. If you got canned pineapple, for example, the fruit was already sliced into rings for you and put in juice. Get an actual pineapple, and you might save yourself a cent or two, but it would also take 10 times the work to get that sucker open. Energy was something people lacked, so whenever they saw convenience that they didn't have to spend a lot on, they'd take it. You could also get canned vegetables and fruit in just about anything. When people saw how much it helped preserve things, they started canning things and putting them in jars with airtight seals as well. The last thing, and I mean the absolute worst-case scenario in the Depression, was you letting something go to waste. It was a precious resource that you no longer had, and everything had to be used until the very last drop, because who was guaranteeing that the house could restock? Luck and nothing else. Stewed apples with bread cubes was a dessert that stretched every bit of fruit to its fullest during the Depression. A few apples, sometimes bruised or close to spoiling, were peeled and stewed with sugar or molasses if available. To make the dish go further, stale bread cubes were added to soak up the syrupy juices. The result was a warm, comforting pudding-like dish that could serve several people with only a handful of apples. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg might be added when they could be spared, but even without them, the dish was sweet and filling. For many children, this was the closest thing to pie they would taste during those years. It turned waste into dessert and brought comfort at the end of long days. Even though it cost next to nothing, it felt like a treat worth remembering. Stewed apples with bread cubes showed how creativity kept hope alive. The Depression era wasn't a time that was marked just by economic ruin, but also environmental destruction thanks to the Dust Bowl. A lot of soil was damaged, so fruits like persimmons, which thrived in poor soil, became essential. You'd see these growing on rocky hillsides, and true to the brand, they were rich in minerals, particularly potassium, which helped when bananas weren't around. They also packed quite a lot of vitamins A and C, which helped keep cases of scurvy in check back in the day. However, that was only the tip of the iceberg. Persimmon could offer more than just basic nutrition. They were good at keeping you active and providing you comfort. How did they do this, you ask? Persimmons, at least fully ripe ones, are incredible sources of sugar. Just one contains the equivalent of a modern energy bar. When people would go out foraging, especially in the Midwest and Southeast where persimmons were naturally growing, they'd always keep an eye out for them. You could also make pudding out of the fruit, which was a real comfort for people who hadn't had something like that in a while. The seeds were also really helpful because when you roasted them, you could ground and brew them as a substitute for coffee beans. So, all in all, this was one fruit you always wanted in your bag, no matter what your situation was. Bananas Foster was a fancy American dessert that actually was made with baking ingredients and rum. The thing is, like I mentioned before, a lot of people had come up with mock and no-bake versions of popular desserts because even basic pantry staples like butter, flour, eggs, and thickening agents were missing. Forget things like frosting and whipped cream, but no, Banana Foster made use of all that and more. It was first made at Brennan's in New Orleans, and the caramelized bananas were what really caught on with people. Of course, when the normal folk could have afforded it in better times, when layoffs weren't a national experience for everyone, it was something they enjoyed too. But right in the heart of the Depression, only the rich could have afforded things like this. Bananas were usually imported out of Central America back then, but they aren't that expensive. It was all the other baking ingredients that would be used for this dish, which made it out of the reach of most people who didn't have fat bank accounts. There were these two restaurants back in the day in New Orleans that were really known for their Banana Foster, and that was Antoine's and Galatoire's in New Orleans. They got a name for making use of bananas in other desserts though, but their Foster was a real knockout. Is this the most metal dinner of the Great Depression? Boiled sheep's head, a meal so intense it had its own built-in stare-down. Folks did indeed boil an entire sheep's head. And no, this is not just urban legend. The head was thoroughly cleaned, seasoned, and simmered for hours until tender. The result? A dish rich in fat, where no part of the animal was wasted. The broth, cheeks, tongue, and eyeballs were all considered delicacies. Good liquid gold for soups or stews. Why eat sheep's head? When money was tight, every scrap of protein was important, and the head had a surprising amount of meat. The families gathered around the table, picking it clean and making the best of what they had. Boiled sheep's head might sound horrifying to modern sensibilities, but for those who could turn something unappealing into a meal worth savoring, it was a source of pride. It was also a lesson in sustainability long before sustainability became a trendy thing. These days, it's a rare dish, but in some cultures, it's a culinary tradition that lives on. Cornbread was also used as a substitute for the typical ingredients you would use for a pancake. And speaking of vegetables, one of the most reliable ones in the Depression for the country as a whole were potatoes. You can kind of see where I'm going with this, can't you? You've probably been around the block with potato pancakes more than a few times in your lifetime, but unless you're from Colorado, you wouldn't know about how the state has a natural tendency for potato farming. That's why any kind of dish that was made out of them was widely popular there, but especially pancakes, because it restored some sense of normalcy in a time that was drastically changing day by day. In the 1930s, even a simple vegetable like celery became the unlikely hero of Depression-era meals. Creamed celery over toast, a humble yet surprisingly popular dish, epitomized how clever cooks transformed economical ingredients into filling comfort food. Celery, inexpensive and versatile, was gently simmered in a basic white sauce, usually crafted from pantry staples like flour, milk, or even broth when dairy was scarce. Creative homemakers sometimes stretched this sauce further with leftover bacon grease or diluted evaporated milk, showcasing remarkable ingenuity when luxury ingredients were distant memories. Poured generously over toasted stale bread, a strategic use of otherwise wasted leftovers, this creamy concoction ensured families stayed full, even if wallets remained empty. Interestingly, celery wasn't merely affordable. It provided valuable vitamins and dietary fiber, critical when balanced nutrition seemed like an impossible goal. Although today celery rarely stars in main dishes, Depression-era potluck tables proudly featured it front and center, proving even the humblest veggies could achieve culinary fame.
A single ham hock could season a pot of beans large enough to feed 8 people for 2 days, and your mother never apologized for there being no sliced ham on the plate. In Black households, During the 1960s, meat was a flavor agent, not a centerpiece. A few strips of fatback gave an entire pot of greens their richness. A neck bone lent body to soup that was mostly vegetables and broth. The old folk song Ham Bone referenced this directly, singing about a bone traveling from kitchen to kitchen because even bare bone still carried flavor. This was economics turned into art. When beef cost more than a family could spend on a Tuesday, the answer was not to skip meat, but to use a small amount so skillfully that every spoonful tasted full. The technique came from West African one-pot traditions, where dried fish or smoked meat flavored large communal stews. Nobody at the table felt poor. That was the whole point.
Tomato custard casserole turned two everyday items, canned tomatoes and eggs, into a richly flavored dinner that captured the resourcefulness of the 1960s. The eggs were whisked with milk and a pinch of sugar before being poured over chopped tomatoes and breadcrumbs, then baked until the custard set and the top turned slightly caramelized. This casserole provided protein, vitamins, and comfort all in one dish without requiring expensive meats or elaborate preparation. Many families served it with buttered toast or a simple green salad, letting the natural acidity of the tomatoes balance the creamy custard. The recipe became a reliable weeknight option because it used inexpensive pantry staples that were always on hand. Its smooth texture and gentle sweetness made it appealing to children, while adults appreciated the subtle complexity that developed as the tomatoes baked. This unassuming casserole is a testament to how mid-century cooks could transform basic ingredients into something hearty, nourishing, and surprisingly elegant with little more than patience and a hot oven. Duck à l'orange is a venerable French dish that pairs roasted duck breast with a vibrant, tangy orange sauce. Its rich history dates back to the 19th century, enjoying popularity among French aristocrats. The duck is typically roasted to achieve a crispy exterior, while the sauce is crafted from a reduction of orange juice, stock, and a hint of Grand Marnier or Cointreau. By the 1970s, this dish had become a hallmark of sophisticated dining, frequently chosen for elegant dinner parties or upscale restaurants. The delightful contrast between the rich, savory duck and the fresh, citrusy sauce creates an unforgettable flavor profile that showcases the dish's aristocratic French origins. The meticulous preparation and exquisite presentation make duck à l'orange a true culinary masterpiece. When the cold winds of the Great Depression swept through poorly insulated homes, many families had to think outside the box. To conserve heat, homemade insulation became a popular and clever fix. Families used newspapers, old rags, cardboard, and even scrap fabric to seal windows, doors, and walls. The goal was simple: keep the warmth in and the chill out. Newspaper, in particular, became a go-to material, as it was inexpensive and abundant, often found piled up in every corner of the house. The ingenuity behind this practice is impressive. People repurposed anything they could find, even turning old coat linings into makeshift window covers. In rural areas, nature contributed with extra layers of hay or straw for insulation, often packed around window frames or used in the walls of barns. These methods were not only about conserving heat, they were about making every inch of the home as efficient as possible. Families worked together, tackling one drafty room at a time, bonding over shared tasks in the process. Today, this frugality is a reminder that sometimes the most resourceful solutions are the simplest, and often the most effective. In fact, homemade insulation is still a viable option in areas where modern insulation can be costly. People used this fruit to make things like ruby grape pies, since no part of the harvest was meant to go to waste. This became a pretty efficient pie to make when you were short on ingredients and couldn't afford the main selling point, which would usually be some kind of fruit. This pie was really popular in places like the Northwest Pacific and California. Places that had a pre-established culture of grape growing took a lot of advantage of it, and places like those even grew red grapes, which is what was used for ruby grape pies. Maybe that was self-explanatory, though. Anyways, one of the things you often hear about the Great Depression is how much everyone struggled to not let anything go to waste. Ruby grape pies particularly called for grapes at a specific stage of their shelf life, which is when they were really ripe, almost bordering on being too ripe to eat. This is why when the grapes did approach that stage, instead of wasting them, people turned them into a nice pie filling that had a vibrant color, a juicy and tart-like flavor, and some real stomach-filling potential. Dishes that looked and tasted nice were a real rarity, so people held this one close. There was also this extreme focus on preserving food however it was possible to. Not just that, people really made the shift towards canned food as well. It didn't help that during the Depression, the production of canned food really took off too. It was always sort of popular, but it was never mass-produced like it was during this time. Nor were all kinds of basic necessities available in canned variants. Now you could have canned tomatoes, pineapples, ham, and all sorts of other basic pantry staples. The kind of stuff you would really need in your everyday cooking. People would preserve their stocks of supplies by using scraps too. Only the tiniest bits of ham were used for soups and meat dishes, and the difference was made up by using vegetables. People would use every part of the animal and not let a single thing go to waste. People would use fat drippings or the toes and tongue of an animal and all kinds of other things. They would learn how to cure meat, store items better, and reuse scraps of leftovers or repurpose them so that they could last just a day or two more. So, about those stews I just talked about. They wouldn't add in just vegetables and potatoes. The entire idea was to not waste even a single thing. That means things outside our modern imagination too. For example, when's the last time you or I have used potato peels? Definitely not in recent memory for me. For people who were alive back then, though, they were literally adding in potato peels to their broths and stews. It was said that they were really good in regards to the amount of fiber they have. Have you ever had a conversation where a gym bro went off on you about micros and macros? You may have heard them mention fiber a lot. While I'm sorry for your wasted time if you've experienced that, I must say, they do have a point too. Fiber helps you be full for much longer and decreases your appetite. People were taking in everything they could to keep their appetites low, really. It's no wonder smoking became such a working-class related phenomenon during this time in America's history. Ketchup sandwiches may sound like a joke today, but in the Depression era, they were a quick meal for children and adults alike. With meat out of reach for many, a slice of bread spread thin with ketchup became lunch or even dinner. The tangy, sweet flavor gave the illusion of something more filling, especially when paired with a second slice of bread. Sometimes butter or margarine was added if available, but most of the time it was just bread and ketchup. While humble, it provided calories when little else was around, and children often looked forward to it simply because it tasted different from the usual plain bread. It was also portable, making it an easy option for workers or school lunches. Though it might not sound appetizing now, it kept hunger away for countless families. For many who grew up in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches became an unforgettable part of their childhood survival. Quince was a Depression-era fruit that didn't have its own success story like most of the fruits we've discussed. They were considered inedible most of the time. That is, until people learned how to cook with them. Once people discovered that they were actually amazing when prepared, public opinion shifted positively. Quinces, eaten in their raw state, are a real challenge. They're extremely hard to bite into, possess a strange tannic flavor that leaves an aftertaste you'd rather forget, and they don't feel good to eat. It's only when you cook them that the diamond hidden beneath all that pale, yellow-hued exterior begins to peek through. Sorry, they're quite yellow, in case you've never seen one. When cooked, though, they actually turn pinkish red, almost like a rose. Not only that, they have hints of all the right flavors. I'm talking tart notes as you bite into it, along with hints of vanilla and an aroma similar to honey. Sounds like a dream, right? It truly was. Cooked quince felt like the perfect blend of apple, pear, and rose, making it amazing for different kinds of preserves and jellies, as well as various poached fruit dishes. Some people did enjoy them straight after cooking, but most liked to experiment with what could be done with them. How often would you find a fruit that was so versatile, pretty, and delicious all in one? The Depression was a bit of a weird time for wine lovers and winemakers. I mean, sure, domestic winemaking was growing firmly as a respectable industry, though it had the obvious setbacks most people were facing during the Depression. However, it wasn't able to capture the biggest market, which was the upper elite class. They were still very much hung up on their imported French delicacies, which were really considered some of the best bottles you could pop open in the entire world. Some of the most famous French wines like Chateau Lafite Rothschild, Chateau Margaux, French Bordeaux, and some other fancy categories of wine like Burgundy, among which Corton Charlemagne and Domaine de la Romanée Conti were extremely popular. Think of the market for these things as really niche and selective, but incredibly dense and active. A bottle of these would cost as much as smoked salmon or truffles, so if you ever stepped into someone's house and they had bottles like these on display, you just knew they were loaded. Not that houses like that were common during the Depression. Culinary creativity and gelatin met, and not always in a good way, in aspic salads. Imagine a jello mold of vegetables, meat, or eggs squirming to the dinner table. But if that doesn't sound appetizing, you're not alone. These savory gelatin dishes were a common way to stretch ingredients during the Great Depression. Affordable and easy to prepare, gelatin was made from boiled animal bones. Families would toss in whatever scraps were available: cooked chicken, canned peas, shredded carrots, hard-boiled eggs, often flavored with broth or tomato juice to create a savory base. It turned out to be a strange mixture that looked like dessert, but tasted like a casserole. Some loved them because aspics were practical, and others hated them because they were so textural. It was filling, but not appetizing, the sight of meat suspended in a quivering jelly. Sunday suppers often featured these salads, served with crackers or bread to make the meal even heartier. Aspic salads are a punchline today, not a recipe, but they are a symbol of a generation that found a way to make do with what it had. They're a wobbly slice of history. Love them or hate them. People living in Arizona were pretty much eating very similarly to how people in Alabama were living. They had beans instead of peas and chili instead of molasses. But chili beans were something that people would eat even in regular times when the economy hadn't caved in on itself. So in that regard, they got off pretty lucky. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but I'm really not kidding. It was a luxury to even have food, but to be able to enjoy it too made you one of the really lucky ones during the Depression. Chili beans, thanks to Mexican influences, let locals live another day. No Depression-era cook worth their salt would let good pickle brine go to waste, especially when flavoring was scarce and budgets tighter than the pickle jar lid. Thus, from humble kitchens emerged pickle soup, a tangy, resourceful dish blending leftover pickle juice, humble root vegetables like potatoes and carrots, and whatever pantry scraps happened to be available. Often thickened slightly with flour or potato starch, cooks could make this broth-based soup surprisingly filling without spending extra pennies. During an era when vinegar and spices were costly luxuries, leftover pickle juice became culinary gold, supplying robust flavor without extra expense. Clever substitutions like garden herbs or diced pickles replaced pricier seasonings, demonstrating Depression cooks' incredible ingenuity. Though today's diners might initially cringe at sipping pickle-flavored broth, the soup had a devoted following in communities with Eastern European heritage, where dill pickles reigned supreme and sour flavors were embraced wholeheartedly. Its tart profile even served as a comforting, affordable winter staple, beloved for its warmth and nutrient-rich ingredients like vitamin-filled veggies that prevented scurvy during harsh times.
But what science cannot measure is how the skillet carried flavor forward, how your mother's cornbread tasted like her mother's because the pan remembered. If the skillet held memory, the cornbread held identity, and the question of sugar told you exactly where a family stood. Black mothers added a pinch of sugar to their cornbread batter, and this single act separated them from white Southern cooks who insisted real cornbread was never sweet. Bob Jeffries wrote in his soul food cookbook that the line between soul food and Southern food came down to choices like this. The sugar was not much, maybe a tablespoon stirred into cornmeal, buttermilk, and egg before it hit the hot greased skillet. But it softened the grit and gave the crust a faint caramel edge that belonged on a Sunday table. Kids who grew up eating sweetened cornbread could taste the difference at someone else's house. That pinch of sugar was a signature, a line drawn in batter that said, "This kitchen belongs to us."
Mashed potatoes with hamburger gravy were the comforting, savory meal that made kids race to the table before the pot even left the stove. Mothers browned small amounts of ground meat, then stretched every drop of drippings into a rich gravy with flour, water, and simple seasoning. Poured over a mound of fluffy potatoes, the gravy turned an inexpensive side into a full meal. Kids loved how the potatoes soaked up the sauce, every bite warm and satisfying. It felt indulgent without being complicated or costly. Mothers appreciated how far a single pound of meat could go when used this way, feeding several people with ease. Kids begged for it because it tasted like the kind of comfort only home could offer. Mashed potatoes with hamburger gravy were proof that thrift could still taste like abundance. Pork belly with cracklings is celebrated for its luxurious flavors and contrasting textures derived from the rich layers of meat and fat found in pork belly. The preparation process starts with scoring the skin and massaging it with a blend of salt, pepper, and aromatic herbs or spices to infuse flavor. The meat is slow roasted at a low temperature to render the fat and tenderize the meat, followed by a blast of high heat to crisp the skin into cracklings. This approach ensures the pork belly stays succulent, while the outer skin turns deliciously crisp. Often served sliced thickly and accompanied by applesauce or a cider reduction, this dish perfectly pairs the pork's richness with a touch of sweet acidity. The allure of pork belly with cracklings lies in the depth of its flavors and the satisfying interplay of tender meat with crispy skin. One of the other things that was pushed to the mainstream thanks to the Dust Bowl was the reliance on one-pot meals. In the biting cold of the Great Depression, staying warm outdoors was a necessity. Families with limited resources couldn't afford heavy winter coats, so they got creative. One surprisingly effective solution was newspaper. Slipping sheets of it inside coats, under shirts, or even between socks and shoes provided an extra layer of insulation that trapped body heat. It was practical, cheap, and easy to find, even if it made crinkling noises with every step. This ingenuity stemmed from the fact that newspapers were widely available, even during tough times. People often saved every issue, not just for reading but for countless uses: insulation, wrapping food, or even patching drafty walls. Nature, too, played a role in this resourcefulness. By mimicking how animals insulate themselves, layering fur or feathers, families used newspaper to create their own version of thermal protection. Outdoor layering also, it highlighted the importance of family. Parents often made sure their kids were properly bundled up before braving the elements, turning layering into an act of care and protection. Apple cornbread crisps were another really popular way of incorporating apples into an ingredient that has lasted many families throughout many droughts. Cornmeal is a staple ingredient for a lot of reasons, but you can sum them up by saying that it's always been there whenever you've needed it most. The Great Depression brought back the culture of apples, especially in rural areas and places with heavy farming land like the South. This used cornmeal to make apple-flavored cornbread, which was actually a pretty comforting dish to eat given the circumstances and the options available at the time. You could kind of call it a hybrid between a cobbler and a fruit pie, as the cornbread crust and the soft, spicy apples underneath definitely give off that feeling. Nope. As you can probably tell, growing fruits and vegetables in your own backyard became an exceptionally important fact of life. One of the other things that people became very fond of growing on a regular basis were grapes, like Concord grapes. This was especially true when you went over to areas like New York and the Midwest, which had a lot of strong potential soil-wise for home grapevines and grapeyards. So, a way of repurposing things and adding fillers was using all kinds of leftovers. This was a pretty vital method of making your food supplies last longer. Those scraps had a lot of value in them because if you piled enough of them together, they definitely made more than a plate or two. Sometimes, you had enough going on in there to make an entirely new dish. People even made casseroles out of leftover scraps of ham, sausages, or beef, potatoes, and breadcrumbs. Faux food and mock food, like using mushrooms to imitate meat-based dishes and using leftover vegetables to add as a filling, were also really common. When people were done with a bird or animal, they would typically keep the bones because it was a great way to enrich your soup a little. That's the same way people began to get rid of stale bread and vegetables that were spoiling too. It was actually something that people theorized made their immune systems tougher. But I think that's just a folk myth. If anything, that would make your immune system more vulnerable, but you have to give credit where it's due. People were nothing if not resourceful during then. So, the next on our list is victory gardens, which I promised you we would talk about. When you think of the phrase victory garden, you might start to think about a bountiful paradise full of fresh harvests and the scent of liberty and conquest. However, this is exactly the opposite of what these are. Victory gardens were basically a band-aid solution that really helped people get by. These opened up an entirely new world of food for people, and their chances of actually being able to support all the mouths in their households opened up phenomenally. In their backyards, people had decided that they would start planting whatever kinds of crops they basically could, from stuff like celery, turnips, onions, garlic, and potatoes, to even things like corn. It meant that people could actually do two things properly once again. They could eat somewhat and find lots of vegetables and herbs to put in their food. Secondly, bartering had made a return in the modern era. After literally centuries since its last appearance, people actually began to trade items with one another for security. A few cloves of garlic in exchange for a ragged shoe, some extra lace and cloth in exchange for a potato, some hand-me-downs in exchange for celery. This was the common way of life for people back then. Peanut soup was a filling option that came straight out of the need for protein when meat was too expensive or unavailable. Ground peanuts simmered with water or milk created a creamy, nutty broth that was surprisingly hearty. Onions, celery, or a bit of leftover potato might be added to give it body, but the peanuts did most of the heavy lifting. The flavor was rich enough that it almost felt indulgent, even though it cost very little to prepare. Served with cornbread or biscuits if available, it could stretch into a complete meal for an entire family. Many households in the South relied on peanuts as a cheap crop, and this soup was a natural way to put them to use. For many children who grew up during the Depression, peanut soup became a nostalgic memory of warmth and survival, showing how simple ingredients could stand in for things they could not afford. Ground cherries were known as husk tomatoes. They were something that most people only knew about if they were around in the Depression. It's an unusual-looking fruit, golden, small, with an awfully fragile-looking husk. Ground cherries were something that could be best described as unique. They looked unique, they felt unique, and they tasted unique. The taste is something I'd say is similar to a blend of vanilla, citrus, and pineapple, as conflicting as those flavors might sound. Unlike a lot of fruits, though, ground cherries were something you could eat right from the get-go. Found one in the wild? All you had to do was pluck it out of the husk and eat it. It used to be an incredible foraged snack for children and other adults. They could be used to make jams, preserves, and even pies. After all, with something that tastes like this, you'd obviously want to see what you can make out of it, right? Depression-era cooks often made recipes like ground cherry pie, and the best part was this was a pie that took very little sugar because of how naturally sweet ground cherries were. Nutritionally, ground cherries were something that had a lot of beta-carotene. This is vomiting that does two things: support your eye health and boost your immune function. Why did you need good eye health? They didn't have screens to get addicted to, right? Well, you'd be surprised what living in polluted environments and working in them too can do to your eyes, and people who could see usually did a lot better than those who couldn't at finding resources in the wild. Pheasant was a wild game bird, but it was considered a rare delicacy. It wasn't the most expensive thing, at least if we're talking about rich people's money, but it was costly. A bird would usually reach $1 to $2, which meant that dishes were for $3 to $4. The real issue with pheasant was that it took a lot of work to store it properly. That meant that only specialized restaurants with top-of-the-line chefs knew how to make the best use of pheasant, and they charged accordingly for their skill and labor. That was also a part of why pheasant was something that was considered luxury dining preserved for the rich. Even if you did find an affordable pheasant at a local joint in states where it was hunted and so it was a bit more accessible, you weren't sure if you could trust the chef to make the best use of the bird. If you wanted to go and have a real pheasant dish, you'd have to step into a fancy place with chefs that were worth the money. Sometimes dinner was just onions, water, and a dream. Depression-era classic born of pure necessity, onion gravy on bread. Onions were the next best thing to flavor whatever scraps you had, or didn't have, when meat was scarce. The result? A simple, savory meal that was surprisingly satisfying, given its humble beginnings. Frying onions in a bit of lard or butter, if you were lucky, then simmering them in water and thickening the mixture with flour was the way the gravy was made. Voila! Pour this over a slice of bread, and dinner was served. Interestingly, onion gravy on bread became such a staple that it wasn't just limited to supper. It sometimes served as a breakfast or lunch, depending on what was available. The beauty of the dish was its ability to stretch the little food that people had into a comforting meal. And while the dish might not have earned high culinary acclaim back in the day, it was a true testament to the resourcefulness and resilience of families during the Great Depression. Even if the bread was stale, the gravy would soften it right up. It wasn't just about feeding an entire family, it was about stretching a single onion. Today, we may not think onion gravy on bread is much of a culinary wonder, but back then it was a lifeline. There's something charmingly rustic about the dish, believe it or not, and it's even made its way into the gourmet circles under fancier names like onion tartines. It wasn't a foodie trend for those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a tribute to creativity in the face of hardship. Canned foods were lifesavers during the Depression, transforming pantries into treasure troves of culinary creativity. Enter Depression-era salmon pea wiggle, a whimsically named dish that brought some much-needed amusement and nutrition to potluck gatherings of the 1930s. At first glance, the unusual combination of canned salmon, peas, and white sauce spooned over crunchy crackers might raise eyebrows today. Yet back then, it represented clever homemaking at its best. Fresh fish was often prohibitively expensive, so budget-savvy cooks leaned on canned salmon, easily accessible and surprisingly nutritious, providing protein and omega-3s without emptying the purse. Similarly, fresh produce shortages led resourceful households to canned peas, giving the dish color and sweetness at minimal cost. The creamy white sauce was typically fashioned from pantry staples. Milk stretched thinly with flour or, in leaner times, water mixed with bacon grease as a tasty substitution. The quirky name wiggle likely came from the slightly jiggly texture of the white sauce, a playful touch, injecting a bit of fun into challenging circumstances.
The smell hit you before you saw what she was doing. Flour in a dry cast iron skillet, no oil, no butter, just heat and patience while she stirred with a wooden spoon until the powder turned from white to tan to the color of peanut shells. Browning flour separately gave gravy a depth that raw flour stirred into drippings could never reach, a toasted, nutty flavor that sat underneath the richness of meat. Leah Chase, the queen of Creole cuisine, whose New Orleans restaurant hosted civil rights strategy sessions in the 1960s, built her legendary dishes on this same dark roux. In kitchens from Mississippi to Chicago, Black mothers used the technique for cream gravy, brown gravy, and the thick sauce that smothered pork chops until they surrendered. You cannot time it with a clock, you time it with your eyes. And once she stopped standing at that skillet, nobody's gravy tasted right again.
Evaporated and powdered milk were the quiet heroes of the poor man's pantry, the kind that didn't look like much but made all the difference. When fresh milk was too expensive or too far to fetch, these tins stepped in. Powdered milk mixed with water could be used for baking, breakfast, and even feeding babies when nothing else was around. Evaporated milk had that thick, sweet flavor that made coffee richer and pies creamier. It was comfort in a can. People learned to trust it because it never spoiled and could sit on a shelf for months. During lean winters, that security meant everything. You'd see families mix a little milk powder with oats, stretch it into gravy, or stir it into mashed potatoes. It might not have been the farm fresh kind, but it carried the same warmth. For many, those tins meant nourishment and dignity in a time when both were scarce. Parsnip and lentil stew was a really good dish. It had the earthiness of parsnips, which were a common thing to grow and buy in farmers' markets and grocery stores. And then you also had lentils. This was a lot better than the potato soups people had become accustomed to all the time while they were trying to make the day go by. It was rustic, nutritious, and it actually was the perfect thing to eat when it was cold. During the winter, it became so hard to afford to spend money on any kind of heating arrangements or winter shoppings. Parsnips and lentil stew was also a vegan-friendly meal, and if you think they hold on to their recipes now, you should have seen them back then. Man, nobody made life easy for them. The best thing about this stew was that you could adapt it to whatever it was you had on hand and could work with. Whether that was medium carrots, celery, tomatoes and onions, or chicken broths and herbs, it would work. All you had to do was adjust to taste, and you were ready to go. It was best to eat this warm, though it wouldn't really work well as a leftover meal. That's why people never made it in bulk unless they were cooking for the entire neighborhood. During the Great Depression, resourcefulness often meant making every calorie of energy and every bit of heat work double duty. The fireless cooker was a brilliant example of this efficiency. Families would heat up a pot of food on the stove, then transfer it still hot into a homemade insulated container packed with blankets, hay, or even straw. The retained heat would finish cooking the meal, saving precious fuel while keeping the container, and often the surrounding area, warm for hours. It was like an early version of the slow cooker, but without the plug. This was a nod to the ingenuity of the time. Fuel was scarce, so using retained heat allowed families to stretch their resources as far as possible. It also had a touch of environmental awareness, though not by choice. By conserving wood or coal, people were unintentionally embracing sustainability long before it became a buzzword. These makeshift cookers also created moments of togetherness. Families would gather around the fireless cooker, eagerly waiting for a warm stew or porridge to be ready. Today, it's a reminder of how creative problem-solving and a little teamwork can go a long way. Plus, who wouldn't appreciate a kitchen hack that saves money and keeps you warm? I don't know if you've ever heard of a 3-ingredient cake, but a Pennsylvania Dutch funny cake is exactly that. It was one of the cakes that was known for its thriftiness and resourcefulness. It took next to nothing to make, only needing chocolate or molasses syrup and an unbaked pie crust. If you had any kind of flour or flour substitute and cocoa powder, that would work too. It was a bit of a celebratory dish at that time, since this one actually did take typical baking ingredients, but the result was worth it. It was a great cake to have on a budget, and it lasted a lot of households, giving them sugar rushes when they desperately needed them more than anything else in the day to survive. During the Depression, it was so common for people to struggle to the point that they would try to be resourceful in any way possible. This included making homemade cleaning products from things that were available and cheap. They used baking soda for things like scrubbing and polishing. Baking soda made for a wonderful surface cleaner, at least as wonderful as a makeshift one could be. When you mixed it with water, it worked to even help clean bathtubs and sinks. Others used white vinegar to clean glasses and any kind of glass surface. There was this brand of soap called Castile soap, which was honestly really good for what it was worth. It was this vegetable-based soap that got popular back then. On top of that, you had borax, which people used for cleaning. All of these things were easy enough to mimic at home. Did you know lemons didn't really have a lot of value as food during the Depression? That was because people would typically save any kind of lemon they had for its juice, which a lot of people used to get rid of odors and disinfect things. So, mock apple pie was the dawn of what you could call America's first experience with Frankensteining their food. Basically, the idea here was to mimic the taste and texture of a real pie. The actual original thing wasn't something people could really get back then, especially because of how hard it was to come by fresh apples. That was a fruit that America always had to import, and, well, there just wasn't a lot of that happening during this whole time period. Still, you have no idea of the importance of food in keeping morale up. A good meal has led armies to victory, so what can it do for a starving population that just needs a win? Mock apple pie was made entirely out of reasons like this. The filling was made from soda crackers, and they would actually soak in all kinds of liquids from the filling. This would help them take a texture that really felt similar to apples, and when they would combine it even more with warm spices like cinnamon and brown sugar, then it would come closer to the real thing. Pantry staples like these, which were still somewhat available, were really helpful during the Depression. Pot liquor with cornbread was a Southern tradition that became a Depression-era favorite because it stretched nothing into something filling. Pot liquor was the nutrient-rich broth left over after boiling greens like collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens. Instead of throwing it away, families would crumble cornbread into the liquid and eat it like a soup. It was packed with vitamins and minerals, even if it cost almost nothing to make. For poor families, it was a way to turn scraps into a full meal. It also carried a sense of comfort, with the familiar flavors of the greens and the cornbread blending together into something that felt substantial. Often it was eaten for dinner when nothing else was left in the pantry, but it still provided strength and nourishment. Many remembered it fondly as both survival food and comfort food, proving that even the simplest things could be cherished. Mulberries were considered a superfood for foragers. They were one of the most invaluable fruits throughout the entirety of the Depression. Mulberries, whether the ones that grew on native red mulberry trees or the white and black ones, which you may be more familiar with, were extremely common. Not just throughout one region or vast expanse of land, but throughout the nation. They were also rich in carbs, which made them one of the best sources of energy. It didn't stop there. They were packed with valuable vitamins, iron, manganese, and sugar, which helped keep people's health strong in tough times. It would especially help in keeping away the effects of starvation. It was also normal for people to have issues of inflammation thanks to their poor diets, rough environments, and labor-intensive jobs. Mulberries were a local remedy for them, whether they were eaten fresh or used in the form of preserves. It helped to keep a stash of mulberries for tough times. Most people just ate them as a snack throughout the day, but it was the fact that they were incredibly easy to grow and adaptable to most kinds of soil that made them such a strong pick for everyone's grandparents, not just ours. This one surprised me, and I think it'll take you for a spin too. Off the top of your head, how much do you think lobster costs, especially back then? Maybe $4 to $7? A bit more if you're eating at some really well-known place? Yeah, that was my guess too. So I thought, rich people definitely could get this. It turns out both you and I would be right. Rich people could definitely get it, but a lot more than we're imagining, because lobster cost a lot less than we're imagining. The actual rates for lobster back then were as little as 10 to 20 cents in coastal areas and in cities with no access to seafood, ones that relied on coastal areas to trade with them for it. It cost around $2 to $4. Lobster dishes themselves were still around $2 to $3, which still makes them more expensive than the average person could afford back then, but not enough that the average rich real estate owner couldn't get his hands on some too. Also, lobster was especially cheap in New England, and it was consumed so plentifully there that it became known as poor man's food. Even in New York, elite establishments like the 21 Club and Delmonico's, the ones that only catered to the rich, always served a pretty curated menu of lobster and other seafood. Prune pudding is evidence that even in hard times, people still wanted a sweet ending to their meal. Fresh fruit was rare during the Great Depression, and prunes, with their long shelf life and natural sweetness, were the unsung heroes of dessert. They weren't glamorous, but they did the job. This was a humble pudding, stewed down to a thick, syrupy base. Prunes were often sweetened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg to improve the flavor. A few cooks even added milk, breadcrumbs, or a touch of lemon juice to brighten the dish. But if you were lucky, it might be topped with a dollop of whipped cream. But that was a luxury. Real quick, If you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Prune pudding was surprisingly nutritionally rich for its simplicity. It wasn't just a treat, it was practical sustenance packed with fiber and vitamins. But its reputation as a digestive aid made it a divisive dessert. It wasn't everyone's idea of a sweet indulgence, to put it mildly. Prune pudding has faded into the background today, often overshadowed by more flashy desserts. In a world fixated on superfoods and functional eating, maybe it's time for this Depression-era favorite to come back. But don't expect it to replace chocolate cake anytime soon. Connecticut was also one of those places that happened to be lucky because of where it was. It's in times like this you learn the importance of territorial advantages, kids. For Connecticut, its plus point was being right next to the coast, which meant that they would always have a steady supply of clams and fish. Clam chowder was something that people there were already used to eating, especially most of the labor force, which were fishermen, so it wasn't too much of a change for them. But what was a pretty jarring thing to adapt to was how little they could get for those same clams and fish now compared to like a year ago. Biscuits have long been staples at American dinner tables, but during the Great Depression, traditional wheat flour biscuits became luxuries families could rarely afford. Ingeniously, home cooks turned to cornmeal, cheap, filling, and abundantly available, to bake cornmeal biscuits with syrup, a comforting alternative that kept everyone satisfied. Cornmeal, originally a Native American staple, gained renewed popularity in the Depression, not only because it was economical, but also due to its nutritional value, providing essential fiber and vitamins at a fraction of the cost. With sugar scarce and expensive, resourceful cooks substituted molasses or homemade syrups to sweeten these biscuits, imparting a delightful caramelized flavor that elevated a simple meal into something special. Bakers cleverly blended modest amounts of wheat flour with cornmeal to keep texture tender without breaking tight budgets. Surprisingly, syrup-sweetened cornmeal biscuits became not only a side dish but also an occasional dessert, proving that versatility was indeed a Depression-era virtue.
Nobody threw away the water left after greens finished cooking. That dark, fragrant liquid, thick with vitamins from hours of slow simmering, was called pot liquor, and Black mothers treated it like medicine. Jackie Torrance, the African-American storyteller, remembered her grandmother making pot liquor from mustard greens, pinto beans, and white potatoes, drinking it warm from a cup. The tradition reached back to West Africa, where dipping starchy foods into the liquid from boiled greens was standard practice, and it survived the Middle Passage and plantation kitchens without losing a generation. Families sopped it up with cornbread, fed it to sick children, and used it as a folk remedy for stomach trouble. Nutritionally, pot liquor contained concentrated vitamins A, C, and K, along with calcium and iron released during cooking. What the rest of the country poured down the drain, Black mothers saved and served the next morning. It cost nothing. It healed everything.
Cane syrup ginger cookies were the winter sweets born from necessity, shaped by families who could not afford refined sugar but still wanted something warm and comforting. Cane syrup was cheaper, accessible, and kept well through the cold months, making it a trusted companion in countless kitchens. Grandma mixed it with flour, fat, and ground ginger, creating a soft dough that smelled like holiday spice even on ordinary afternoons. When the cookies baked, they spread into soft, chewy circles with edges that crisped just enough to snap gently under your teeth. The flavor was deep, warm, and earthy, the kind of sweetness that lingered rather than shouted. Families cherished these cookies because they brought joy without requiring ingredients that winter budgets could not handle. They tasted like generosity in lean times, a reminder that sweetness did not need to be extravagant to matter. Cane syrup ginger cookies were humble but powerful, a dessert that made cold days feel kinder. Wessonality Surprise was designed for speed and efficiency. No complicated steps, no long cooking times. Just a few pantry staples thrown together and baked into something that resembled a casserole. Canned green beans, already a staple in American kitchens, made the dish feel like a balanced meal, while the condensed tomato soup added a rich, slightly sweet tang. For families in the 60s, this kind of cooking was about making every dollar count. It was fast, it was filling, and thanks to Wesson's marketing, it became one of many quirky ad-driven meals that defined a generation of home cooking. A little strange? Maybe. But for busy families, it worked. When the Great Depression gripped the country, homes were often drafty and poorly insulated, making it nearly impossible to keep the chill at bay. But families found a simple yet effective solution: draft stoppers. Old rags, torn-up clothes, and fabric scraps were stuffed into gaps beneath doors and around windows, blocking out the cold and keeping heat inside. It was a no-cost fix that required nothing more than some basic ingenuity and a willingness to make do with what was on hand. Nature's role in this process was subtle but significant. People living in rural areas often used materials like hay or straw, both readily available from farms, to stuff into drafty cracks. But even in urban neighborhoods, a bit of creativity could turn any leftover fabric, be it an old jacket or an unused pillowcase, into a barrier against the cold. This practice also promoted a sense of shared responsibility within the household. Family members worked together to make their homes as warm as possible, often taking turns stuffing rags into troublesome spots. The lesson here is clear. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective, and a little frugality can go a long way in creating comfort. I think if you had to circle out and pick one specific dish that best shows the kind of mentality people were under every day during the Great Depression, you would pick water pie. The name itself shows you how frugal this dish really is, and it's pretty true to the branding too. It just takes water, flour, and sugar, and if available, you can use butter and vanilla extract. A lot of people took notes out of mock food culture, which itself was a product of the Depression. People would try to make imitations of actual popular dishes, but since the ingredients were never available for them, and usually the goal was to make something that could feed the entire family, imitations using inferior ingredients or substitutes became popular. This pie didn't even really need eggs and milk, and it showed just how much people were willing to make do with whatever they had, as long as they got some food. You just pour water into a pre-baked crust and then mix in pretty small amounts of the rest of the ingredients because you still want to be saving. The taste wasn't as strong as it could have been if people were a bit more generous, but for what it was worth and how much the ingredients were stretched, it did still taste amazing. It was more of a custard on the inside than a pie, but it was definitely a way to have a pie craving satisfied back then. Yet another way people would stretch out supplies and make sure that any and all shopping trips were avoided: repurposing items, janky, rusted tools, break them down into cutters or glue them together and make it work. Use that shoe with a hole in it, the one that's missing a few laces too. Take a sack of feed and cut it. You can use the cloth. Don't let any thread, needle, or clip go to waste. Learn to sew, because it's going to save your life. Repurpose any kind of cloth you can find into skirts, sweaters, scarves, curtains, or anything that means you don't have to spend more on unnecessary things. Any money people had was something they could only afford to spend on food, nothing else. Lots of families typically just lived off of hand-me-downs, especially ones with big sibling populations. The ones that didn't have those, it became common for families to move in with each other and survive the drought together. This meant that their wardrobes would get recycled too. Old furniture was another gold mine for resourceful families. Broken chairs were transformed into firewood or stripped for parts to repair other items. Even worn-out bedding found a second life. Mattresses were restuffed with anything soft, from old fabric scraps to straw. Glass jars were cleaned and reused to store everything from preserved foods to sewing supplies. Families also salvaged buttons, zippers, and patches from torn clothes to mend others, ensuring nothing was discarded if it had potential use. Besides using stale bread in imaginative ways such as pudding and porridge, it meant that people used breadcrumbs as fillers too. This was helpful for a number of reasons. First of all, breadcrumbs actually make for an excellent binding agent. They're super good at holding the meat together, and this was necessary for more than a few reasons. You start making these makeshift meatloaves with limited ingredients, and you realize they actually don't hold together that well. Secondly, lots of the things that gave meatloaves their moisture were things like eggs, milk, and a good broth. Of course, milk and eggs were in direly short supply for most households in America during the Depression. Adding breadcrumbs was a way for your meatloaf to still keep some kind of moisture. Also, during the process, breadcrumbs would eventually soften and give the meatloaf a better texture overall. It meant that you only had stale bread without the crumbs, and now you're also going to be having meatloaf with it. Pretty good deal, right? Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Osage orange, also known as a hedge apple or a horse apple, isn't really a fruit that's meant to be anywhere near your stomach. That doesn't mean it can't be useful, though, and that's exactly what happened during the Great Depression. It was a fruit that was native to Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. People planted it outside of those areas too, but in these ones, the potential for foraging was much higher. The Osage orange trees on which these grew were actually a part of the natural layout of the land, acting as organic fencing. That is until barbed wire became more common, and development meant that a decent amount of them were cut down. These were green fruits filled with latex, and that made them a poor choice for eating, but sometimes you could give it to your cattle and pigs. Still, Osage orange was most known for its wood, which is extremely durable and rot-resistant. Osage orange wood was used to make bows, doors, tables, tool handles, and even fence posts. Families would cut and sell this wood for the decent amount of money you would make, as even despite the Depression, demand for this was always there. Creamed brains on toast is the meal that makes squeamish eaters bolt from the table if there ever was one. During the Great Depression, resourcefulness was king, and nothing went to waste, not even a part of the animal. While many struggling families would eat brains, they were a delicacy. Don't be fooled by the word delicacy. This dish was born out of necessity, not gourmet aspirations. Making it was straightforward. Brains were boiled or sautéed with onions, milk, and a pinch of seasoning, cow or pig being the usual suspects. The mixture thickened to a creamy consistency and was ladled over toasted bread, often the stale kind, because, waste not, want not. It looked like a bizarre version of gravy toast, but it was Instagram-worthy, and it did fill bellies when there were few other options. Brains were rich and almost buttery, but convincing anyone to dig in was another matter entirely. Kids were probably bribed with the promise of dessert if they cleaned their plates even then. Creamed brains on toast is a long-gone American culinary staple today, existing only in the fringes of foodie culture, or as a trivia question about survival food. This dish is the love-it-or-leave-it symbol of grit and ingenuity. Alaska, on the other hand, was luckier. They had the privilege of being next to bodies of water, so they could actually catch their food hunter-gatherer style and essentially eat for free. Subsistence living became the normal lifestyle that people incorporated into their weekly routines, and one of the best ways to sustain an entire family and take advantage of the bounty of nature was fish and game stews. Any kind of stew would work. It wouldn't really be a proper recipe, and a lot of the time it would just be using whatever hands-on ingredients they could come up with. But hey, it filled everyone's bowl. When family budgets tightened dramatically during the Depression, barley, once considered animal feed, stepped onto American dinner tables as an affordable, nourishing staple. The barley and tomato casserole, a hearty yet humble dish, combined economical barley grains with tangy tomatoes, creating a filling meal out of ingredients previously overlooked or underrated. Home cooks showcased remarkable resourcefulness by swapping out expensive meats with barley's chewy, filling texture, enhanced by canned or fresh garden tomatoes simmered into flavorful sauces. Interestingly, barley wasn't just cheap. It provided valuable dietary fiber and nutrients, making it a healthier option in tough times. If tomatoes ran short, resourceful cooks substituted home-canned tomato juice or even diluted ketchup, highlighting creativity under pressure, though admittedly, the ketchup option probably raised some skeptical eyebrows at potluck dinners. While barley may not have won culinary glamour points, it earned respect as a sturdy and reliable pantry staple, helping households avoid hunger when pricier grains were beyond reach. This casserole's presence at community gatherings represented more than just sustenance. It symbolized the era's determination to stretch ingredients creatively without sacrificing nourishment or taste.
The skillet was older than your mother. It came from her mother, who got it from hers, and each woman added another layer of seasoning no store could sell. In the 1960s, Black families treated cast iron like heirlooms, rubbing them with pork fat after every use, never touching them with soap. The fat polymerized into a slick, dark coating, better than any nonstick surface invented since. Your grandmother heated the skillet slowly, wiped it with lard using a folded cloth, and let it cool in the oven until the metal absorbed everything. That coating held decades of Sunday dinners, fish fries, and Wednesday night cornbread. The iron leached into food, giving families extra dietary iron during years when nutrition was a luxury. Scientists confirmed that cooking acidic foods in cast iron increases the iron content of a meal.
Cornmeal drop dumplings in broth were a warm meal born from desperation and a little genius. When meat was scarce and soup looked too thin, a quick cornmeal batter could save dinner. You'd mix cornmeal with water or milk, pinch off little balls, and drop them into bubbling broth to puff and soak up the flavor. They came out soft, dense, and delicious, tiny golden pillows floating in the pot. The smell of simmering broth filled the house, carrying a quiet promise that everyone would eat tonight. It was the kind of recipe that stretched the smallest pot of soup into something that could feed a family. Some added onions or pepper, others just relied on the broth to do the heavy lifting. Either way, it worked. Cornmeal drop dumplings didn't just fill bellies, they lifted spirits. They were proof that a handful of meal and water could turn hunger into gratitude. Stuff like vegetable pot pie with a biscuit crust really made the rounds just about everywhere. It was because it was so easy to pool together different kinds of vegetables to make one massive serving of pot pie, oftentimes more than just for a family. People would basically realize this. If they shared the amount of vegetables and resources they had, they could honestly make a lot more. Community-based ingredient sharing and food preparation once again became a thing. Entire neighborhoods were once again eating together, and it was a big part of how people managed to survive. This pot pie was a one-stop solution to massive amounts of hunger, and often people would throw in whatever kind of vegetables they had in there. This would typically look like your average mix of cabbage, onions, garlic, tomatoes, potatoes, and the rest, but people would try to add in aromatics to get some flavor going too. It was little stuff like this that really helped keep things together for everyone because, on their own, people didn't have the energy to cook big meals like this very often. When store-bought clothes and blankets were out of reach for many families, the motto was simple: use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. Old coats, curtains, and even burlap sacks were given new life as warm clothing or quilts. Worn-out trousers became patchwork blankets, while burlap sacks, sometimes dyed or embroidered, were transformed into dresses, aprons, or mittens. It was practical creativity at its finest, proving that fashion can indeed be forged from function. This was an art form born out of necessity. Many families turned to sewing and mending as a way to keep warm, using skills passed down through generations. A tattered curtain might be stitched into a winter coat, and an old coat's lining could become insulation for a quilt. Even the natural environment played a part. Burlap sacks, used to transport grains and produce, became a staple for rural families. This practice also brought families together. Children learned to sew alongside their parents, sharing in the process of turning scraps into survival. Today, the idea of upcycling fabrics has come full circle, with modern sustainability movements embracing what Depression-era families mastered out of sheer necessity. It turns out, the original thrift store chic was just a warm hug in disguise. Back then, refrigeration as we know it wasn't really a thing. People had these things called ice boxes instead, which is how they stored whatever food needed chilling. One of those was oatmeal and coconut cookies, which were famously known for being kept in ice boxes to preserve their flavor. Oatmeal cookies have already been something that Americans had a deep, intimate relationship with for a long time, even before the 20th century. And coconut was a largely inexpensive ingredient, so it's not a wonder to me that this dish found a new reason to be adopted by home chefs everywhere. Remember how I said victory gardens were a good source of income? They weren't just that. These gardens helped for another reason, one unique to the Depression. This was the return of the bartering system. It became extremely common to barter for any kind of good or service since money didn't really have the same value, nor was it something people had, honestly. Whatever money they did have, they would save for official places like grocery marts and markets, where that was the only way they could buy things. Amongst each other, people started to barter. They would trade the things they grew in their victory gardens, and two of the easiest things to grow and really popular to trade were potatoes and tomatoes. They could go with just about anything, and all kinds of soups and stews used them. Then people would trade their hand-me-downs, basic kitchen tools, a shoelace, some soles, basically anything and everything that would mean you wouldn't have to waste money on repairs or buy something new when you could make what you have last just a bit longer. Despite what you hear about the Depression every now and then, it actually was true that people started to make all kinds of gravy from drippings. It was a pretty practical way of making use of scraps and leftovers, after all. Drippings kind of mean the fat that people got from cooking meat. Every time they would cook any kind of meat, they'd always gather the fat drippings from it. This was true of beef, pork, chicken, and just about everything else that was considered meat. Food was really scarce during the Depression, and the budgets were even tighter. There wasn't room to waste anything and spend more money on buying packets of meat one after the other. After the cooking was done, people would take the fat and use that as a base for the gravy they'd eventually make. Some of that all-purpose flour we went over earlier would also help thicken the fat and give it this really nice texture that actually resembles something like a gravy. Plus, a makeshift sauce could be made that would be served with basic vegetables and herbs. Fat needs to be stored, though, and it was hard to store enough of it to make sure you had a good supply that would last you, but also wouldn't spoil. People had to get good at all kinds of things, and budgeting your resources, not just your dollars, was one of them. Potato rarebit was one of the Depression's clever ways to make potatoes feel more special than they were. The base idea was to take mashed or sliced potatoes and top them with a thin sauce of cheese, milk, and spices. Cheese was often scarce, so the sauce was made with very small amounts stretched as far as possible, sometimes even flavored with mustard to give it more punch. The result was a dish that felt rich and indulgent, even though it used little more than potatoes and scraps of cheese. Families would bake or broil it to give the top a golden crust, making it even more appealing. It was filling, cheap, and versatile, perfect for serving a large family. Children especially loved when potatoes got transformed this way, since it was a rare chance to enjoy something creamy and flavorful. Potato rarebit may not be common today, but it was beloved back then. Elderberries in North America were some of the most foraged fruits to ever make a name for themselves in Depression history. They were found throughout much of the eastern stretch of the United States. Elderberries were tough and resilient, And they were the kind of fruits that enjoyed climates no other crop or fruit would take to. You'd find elderberries growing alongside the strangest of places: fence sides, abandoned fields, roadsides, and rocky cliffs that just didn't have anything else growing. Elderberry bushes had grown to become super adaptable. They could handle a lot of droughts, and trust me, there was more than enough of that to go around. They could stand in the rain for days, no problem. As long as they got enough sunlight, they were easy to grow. Families could maintain steady supplies every year without any kind of effort or diligent care. Elderberries were kind of like a stew in a slow cooker. You'd just leave it for a couple of hours and come back to a great little meal. The berries themselves were incredible antioxidants. They were essential in managing colds and flu, especially in young children. Besides just their extensive medicinal use, the flowers of elderberries were something that people used to make teas, cordials, and fritters. Sometimes people even sold wine or syrup they had made from elderberry. It had become a reliable source of quick change at a time when that was hard to make. Yet another aspect of French culture that America as a country could never do away with, even in times as harsh and frugal as the Depression, was brie cheese. This was a really special kind of cheese because it had this incredibly soft texture with a rich, creamy interior and a bloomy rind that made it top dog in the cheese world. Everyone was singing the praises of brie cheese and how it was yet another culinary goldmine discovered by the French, forever enriching the food scene globally. Imported French brie was around 30 to 50 cents per pound, and popular brands from regions known for their cheesemaking like Brie de Meaux and Brie de Melun were even more expensive. You could expect prices to go up to $1 or $2 for a pound, but if you wanted genuine, authentic brie cheese, and I mean the real stuff, absolute genuine article, then you'd have to go to novelty shops that specialize in cheese. High-end grocery stores were one thing, but they were still buying in bulk and from people that were mass-producing cheese to make a pretty penny. They didn't have the love of the game that specialty shops did. The cheese they would sell would be genuinely some of the best cheese you could find in terms of imports. Potted meat spread. The 1930s tin can be savior. You're absolutely right if you're imagining mystery meat mashed into a paste. However, let's face it, that little tin of potted meat was the hero of many Depression-era meals. This questionable concoction was spread on crackers or smeared between slices of stale bread and kept families fed when other protein sources were out of reach. Potted meat spread was made from finely ground scraps of pork or beef, seasoned with salt, spices, and sometimes gelatin, and had a long shelf life and a low price tag. Others got creative, adding it to onions or pickles to add some flavor. Some were not so lucky and ate it straight from the can. And let's not forget the genius marketing. Even if potted meat wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, it was often marketed as the ultimate protein-packed snack for families on the go. During a time when home-cooked meals were often replaced by anything that could be prepared quickly, it was cheap, filling, and in its own way, a miracle worker. Was it delicious? Probably not. It was practical, portable, and didn't need cooking. A major bonus when every penny counted. Potted meat spread still lives on in grocery aisles as a throwback to those hard times. You won't see it on the center of a modern charcuterie board, but it's a reminder of survival, ingenuity, and the pure will to make something edible out of almost nothing. One of the things you'll often hear your grandparents repeating like a broken record or a parrot is the importance of corn in your diet and how you really need to eat your greens and your corn. Well, it's not for nothing. Cut them some slack and just lend an ear the next time you hear it, because in Arkansas, and in a majority of other states too, fried cornbread and greens were the daily lunch and breakfast of many families. Cornbread in general was ridiculously cheap and easy to get, and it was common for people to barter with it or for it too, so it definitely got a lot of mileage in Arkansas, thanks to them always having a knack for growing corn. During the Great Depression, vegetables like carrots and potatoes were kitchen VIPs, not because of glamour, but sheer affordability and availability. The humble yet flavorful carrot and potato bake, a casserole of thinly sliced potatoes combined with brightly grated carrots, became a potluck favorite precisely because it cleverly stretched ingredients without sacrificing nutrition or taste. To keep budgets intact, Thrifty cooks relied on simple additions like flour, thickened milk, or leftover broth instead of costly cream, and seasoned it sparingly with homegrown herbs or scraps of onion, turning basic veggies into something delightfully savory. Interestingly, carrots, high in vitamin A, gained popularity during tough economic times, not only because they were cheap, but they also boosted nutrition at a time when balanced diets seemed harder than balancing checkbooks. Potato slices baked tenderly alongside carrots delivered comforting carbs and vital nutrients, creating an unexpectedly hearty dish without meat or expensive dairy. Families attending potluck gatherings eagerly welcomed casseroles like this, a nutritious yet inexpensive way to ensure everyone left the dinner full, even if wallets stayed empty.
Black mothers in the 1960s cooked by the look of the batter, the weight of flour in a cupped palm, the color of the roux as it darkened. A pinch meant something specific to her fingers. A splash of vanilla was always the same splash. She knew biscuit dough was right by how it pulled from her hands, and she knew rice had enough water by pressing her fingertip to the surface. This was mastery passed from mother to daughter through thousands of repetitions, a cooking language built on touch rather than numbers. The knowledge came from West African kitchens where written recipes never existed, carried through plantation houses where enslaved women fed dozens without a single instruction card. You learned by standing next to her, watching her hands, and when she died, no cookbook could teach you what she knew.
Tomato soup with grilled cheese was the rainy day classic that never failed to make kids feel warm from the inside out. The moment a storm cloud rolled in, kids would start hoping their mothers would make this exact combo because nothing else matched the feeling of dipping a buttery sandwich into a bowl of steaming soup. The soup usually came straight from a can, cheap and dependable, mixed with water or milk to make it smoother. As it heated, the rich tomato smell filled the room, promising comfort before you even took the first bite. Meanwhile, the grilled cheese sizzled in a pan, the bread crisping in butter until it turned that perfect shade of golden brown. When the cheese melted completely, stretching in strings when you pulled the sandwich apart, you knew dinner was going to be perfect. Kids could barely wait for the soup to cool down before dipping the sandwich into it, soaking up all that warmth and flavor in one bite. It was simple, cheap, and so easy that mothers could make it even on their most exhausted days. But it never felt tired or ordinary. It felt like kindness in a bowl. It tasted like being taken care of. Kids begged for this meal because it felt like a warm hug, the food equivalent of being wrapped in a blanket while the world outside stayed cold and gray. It was childhood comfort at its absolute best. Veal Parmigiana brings a little taste of Italian-American heritage to the table, featuring breaded veal cutlets smothered in tomato sauce and melted cheese. Born in the kitchens of Italian immigrant communities in the U.S., this dish was a clever adaptation of traditional Italian recipes, tailored to American tastes. It first surfaced in the early 20th century, with Italian-American families swapping out eggplant for veal. Introduced in Italian-American eateries soon after, veal parmigiana became a staple. The preparation? Bread those veal cutlets, fry them up, layer with marinara sauce, and a good helping of mozzarella or parmesan, then bake it until it's bubbling and golden. It hit its peak popularity in the 1950s and 1960s, often accompanied by pasta, crafting a hearty and satisfying meal. When money was scarce and firewood even scarcer, families during the Great Depression turned to whatever they could find to keep their fires burning. Necessity transformed ordinary and sometimes unusual materials into lifelines. Corn cobs, left over after the kernels were eaten, became a popular fuel source in rural areas. They burned quickly but efficiently, making them perfect for stoves and small fires. Dried animal dung, used for centuries by various cultures, was also repurposed as fuel on farms where livestock was common. Even coal scraps discarded by mining operations found a second life in the hearths of resourceful families. This was an ingenious blend of frugality and environmental adaptation. Nothing went to waste, Every bit of material was reused or repurposed. Coal scraps, for instance, were often scavenged by entire communities near mining towns. Children would gather the remnants, bringing home enough to keep their homes warm for another day. It's hard to imagine, but in those days, the phrase, "one man's trash is another man's treasure," could be taken quite literally. While burning corn cobs might not be the norm anymore, it's a reminder that even in the harshest times, people found ways to adapt and to persevere. One of the most widely consumed ingredients in the entire Great Depression was potato. This star quarterback of a vegetable saved so many people's weekly dinner plans, it's really not even funny. Potatoes could also be homegrown, and with the Depression, a concept known as backyard gardening became a thing. People used to grow crops in their backyards wherever they could, either to keep getting new food that didn't cost anything or to sell it for other stuff. One of the best ones to grow was a potato because you could make anything out of it, like potato donuts. These were even store-bought, and they were still really cheap. Think of them like soft, starchy, melt-in-your-mouth donuts made out of mashed potatoes. So, a big way that people ended up saving tons of money during the Great Depression was the concept of a victory garden. Basically, these are just tiny patches of land you use for cultivating and growing crops and vegetables in your backyard. The term victory garden comes from some wartime slang, but the gardens themselves were totally genius. It was getting very hard for Americans to shop for vegetables, especially since so many families were doing nothing but relying on basic crops to get by. Victory gardens gave all kinds of families an edge in the Depression because it let them grow a lot of different kinds of things for free. Not only did this mean that people had a source of food locked down, they also had a source of income. People could sell the things they grew in their gardens, or even rent the space out to others so that they could grow as well. Even the government was all for these gardens and regularly published resources that would help people understand how to grow and take care of one. It took a while before people were able to properly grow and maintain one, as no one's green thumb was really all that good, but eventually people got the hang of it and even retained the skill as a side hobby after things settled down. Another really popular part of the Depression diet and appetite was how people really took to making dumplings. No, seriously. I know nowadays we go out for them and they cost an arm and a leg and you're like, but they're just dumplings? And I'm right on board with that train of thought. Back then, though, you gotta understand, flour was in a different position. Well, everything was. Things hadn't become that expensive, though they were definitely massively unaffordable by the standards of the people who were living in those times. The way people got to making dumplings during the Depression was by actually making use of things like all-purpose flour and water. They would end up making serviceable enough dumplings, and they would actually be really good to make for special occasions, or when you wanted to give yourself a little treat after finally being able to spare one too. It meant that people were eating at least something they enjoyed. It wasn't popular in just communities that had traditions around dumpling making too, but those communities outstretched their hand and taught people all the tricks they could to make better ones. Community living was a real thing back then. It had to be. People were simply more resourceful in numbers. Rolled oat meatloaf was another way people made do when meat was a rare luxury during the Depression era. The idea was simple. Oats were cheap, filling, and easy to find, so they became the backbone of many loaves when ground beef was scarce. Housewives would combine rolled oats with onion, a little broth or tomato juice, and perhaps an egg if one could be spared, then bake it until firm. The oats took on the flavor of the few seasonings and drippings that were used, giving the illusion of meat even if very little was present. If there was any beef or pork to add, it stretched further thanks to the bulk of the oats. Served with gravy made from pan drippings or even a thin tomato sauce, it could feel hearty enough to pass for the real thing. Many families came to appreciate the flavor and comfort it provided, even without meat. But hey, let's say you don't happen to have a couple of handy rivers to water your soil and grow your trees and food naturally. What do you do? In wetlands in the Deep South, people often ate mayhaw. It was pretty typical swamp fare too. Mayhaws would grow best in flooded woodlands and swampy riverbanks. You'd think nothing worth eating would grow in an environment like that. but their natural resistance to wet soil ended up making them ideal for it. It also meant that they were great for foraging during the Depression because, despite the harsh conditions, these fruits were some tough customers. They would still stay edible. They were resistant to disease. They could still serve in low-quality acidic soil. And when you ate them, you didn't have to just settle for some fruit you picked up from a swamp. You could actually make jelly out of mayhaw, which helped people stretch their supplies and save their strawberry jam for when it really counted. They were low-calorie, so they weren't that good for energy like pawpaw, but they were pretty medicinal. They came in handy in folk remedies for heart health and circulation. The biggest reason people ate these was probably because they came in early spring, and besides, the sigh of the small red fruits ripening was relieving to some. We're still not done with France. It's just something you have to wrap your head around. The 20th century was dominated by our exploration of French food culture and their cuisines, both the early and late parts of it. Don't even get me started on the middle of the 20th century. Anyway, escargots were basically snails that were imported from French shores and sold for a few bucks when they touched down here. Premier French restaurants in New York would always have this as one of their finest aspects of French appetizers, and it was definitely popular with the rich crowd. It wasn't really all that good to most people because it was a bit out of touch with the kind of taste palettes and flavor profiles that were jibing with the American people back then, because a lot of people had different tastes. I don't mean that in the general different strokes for different folks kind of way. I mean that as a result of rationing for years and then foraging and living off of vegetable soups and stews, people had gotten more accustomed to things like potatoes, greens, and squirrel meat. So there wasn't much of a demand for snails to shine with the mass public anyway. Where they did get some value was in places like Le Pavillon and La Côte Basque in New York, which would only cater to the elite and were known as being strong footholds of French cooking in America. Surprise spice cake is a prime example of how Depression-era cooks knew how to turn a lack of ingredients into a culinary triumph. No eggs, butter, or milk? No problem. This cake was made with pantry staples and a little ingenuity, and turned out moist, flavorful, and most importantly, budget-friendly. Often the surprise was in its unexpected ingredients. Some of the versions used mayonnaise in place of eggs and oil, vinegar, or even tomato soup to add moisture. The warm spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, did double duty to cover odd flavors and provide the cake with its signature aroma. If they had raisins, nuts, or applesauce on hand, they threw those in, and each version was different. The surprise spice cake was a hit at potlucks and family gatherings because it didn't taste like a compromise. It was rich and comforting and proof that you didn't have to use fancy ingredients to make something special. This cake has fallen out of favor, but some of its descendants, like mayonnaise cake, still turn up in recipe books. It's a sweet reminder that even in the toughest of times, people find ways to treat themselves and one another. The best desserts sometimes come from thinking outside the box, or in this case, the pantry. Georgia had Hoppin' Johns, which was a piece of culture that was taken from the Gullah people, an African-American tribe that had a long-established presence in the state. Their cooking methods relied a lot on natural, organic food. Fruits, peas, beans, stuff like that. That's why there was such an interest from the broader community into how they cooked things, because they wanted to know how to make the best use of ingredients like that too. Luckily, the Hoppin' John recipe spread enough that it became a household name. It was really just rice and peas, but it was homely and cozy, feelings that you just could not get during the Depression. When meats and finer vegetables vanished from many kitchen tables during the Depression, resourceful cooks reached for something far humbler: the trusty turnip. Often overlooked today, turnips became an affordable culinary hero back then, especially in dishes like creamed turnips on biscuits, a comfort food innovation born from sheer necessity. Turnips were sliced, simmered until tender, and gently folded into a creamy sauce, a clever trick to stretch a few spoonfuls of milk or butter across multiple servings. If dairy was scarce, cooks ingeniously substituted bacon grease or broth, giving this humble root vegetable a savory boost without breaking the bank. Spooned generously over biscuits, often homemade from inexpensive flour and baking soda, This dish was a hearty solution when pantries looked depressingly bare. Surprisingly, turnips weren't merely filler food. They offered crucial vitamins like C and fiber, essential nutrients when fresh produce options were limited. Turnips also stored remarkably well, becoming a pantry staple in homes nationwide, meaning even families without gardens had dependable access to fresh vegetables throughout winter.
But if the weeknight skillet held quiet rhythms of survival, the holiday table held something louder, and nothing announced a celebration like a ham glazed with Coca-Cola. Your mother scored the fat in diamond patterns, studded each cross with a whole clove, and poured an entire bottle of Coke over the top before the pan went in the oven. The phosphoric acid tenderized the outer layer, while the sugar caramelized into a glaze so dark and sticky it looked like lacquer. The kitchen smelled like Christmas for hours. This hack came from the collision of Southern cooking and American consumer culture, where a 5-cent soda became an ingredient no fancy product could outperform. At church dinners and reunions, the woman who brought the Coca-Cola ham never took home leftovers. Kids peeled strips of the sweet, salty crust off the edges before adults said grace. The recipe traveled by reputation, one mother telling another, never written down because nobody who tasted it could forget.
Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. With a simple pot and a little seasoning, this one-dish meal fed entire families with ease. It was the kind of food that tasted even better the next day, reheated on the stove after a long shift or a day at school. Comfort food without the price tag. Beef bourguignon is a cornerstone from Burgundy, involving marinated and slow-cooked beef chunks, typically tougher cuts like chuck, bathed in red wine, usually Burgundy, to tenderize the meat over several hours. This hearty stew is fortified with onions, garlic, and carrots, and enhanced with sautéed mushrooms and crisp lardons. Historically, this method likely evolved as a means to tenderize and enrich less desirable cuts of meat. The stew develops a rich, deep umami flavor from the Maillard reaction, which occurs as the beef browns, and the complex flavors intensify as the wine slowly melds with the herbs and vegetables. The slow cooking process not only enriches the stew's flavor, but also fills the kitchen with an inviting aromatic warmth, making beef bourguignon synonymous with comforting, rich French culinary tradition. In a time when heating was expensive and resources were scarce, families during the Great Depression turned to a natural, free source of warmth: the sun. Capitalizing on every sunny moment, they would gather near windows to soak up the heat from the daylight. This wasn't just about enjoying a bit of sunshine, but also a strategy to stay warm and conserve fuel. By sitting close to the glass, people maximized the heat trapped inside, making the most of the sun's natural energy. The role of nature was clear. The sun, when it shone, became a vital part of home heating. On clear days, people would move furniture to optimize sunlight exposure, often taking turns to bask in the warmth. With homes built with larger windows in mind, especially in rural areas, this practice became a clever adaptation of the environment. This practice also fostered family togetherness. On sunny days, households would find themselves gathering in the same room, warming their bodies and spirits. Today, we can take a page from this frugality. Natural heat, though often overlooked in modern times, is still a powerful resource, reminding us that sometimes a little sunlight can go a long way, both in saving money and lifting spirits. If you still remember, a while ago I mentioned how much love canned fruits had been receiving both as a concept and a practical part of everyday life. They even became something of a lifeline during the Depression because they were some of the most popularly distributed items you could get from government relief efforts or organizations. As a result, people started making dishes that made full use of all kinds of salads. Things like frozen fruit salads used all the canned fruits available, usually pineapples, oranges, cherries, or something like bananas, and then mixed them with mayonnaise or cream, eventually freezing them in molds in the final step. If available, a bit of sugar and marshmallow was also used for extra sweetness, but I wouldn't rely on most homes to have marshmallows back then. Anyway, this was a cheap and easy salad you could prepare in bulk that also gave the family a shot of some much-needed nutrition. People learned a lot more skills than just learning to sew during the Depression. A lot of people also began their careers in amateur brewing. There were loads of reasons for this, some that you can probably imagine right away, and some that are pretty context-specific because they rely on things that happened right around the Depression. While some cider and a cold one were never really that expensive during the time the Depression was set, it was still a very unnecessary cost and something that people couldn't justify spending their money on. There was all kinds of unemployment, and there were also efforts from the government to ensure that substance abuse doesn't get any worse than it was. See, this was a terrible time for people to not be able to afford beer or make the space for it in their budget. Why? Two things. It was a time when people really needed beer, and it was also a time when people had just come fresh off of Prohibition, where they, exclusively learned how to ferment and make the stuff at home. Bootlegging distilled spirits became common, and moonshine became the next love of America. Was it illegal? Sure. Did it get you absolutely flat-out drunk? Absolutely. One of the best ways for sustenance during this entire fiasco was easily corn. Cornmeal, in specific, was really helpful for the masses. This is because corn was one of the few crops that America could grow native to its own soil. It was also one of the few crops that was not experiencing massive amounts of failure during harvest. I really can't stress how bad this time was for the land as well, not just the people. The Dust Bowl was something that left all kinds of consequences on the face of the country. Crops seriously were never ever growing. People were trying to find their green thumb and get something going in victory gardens, which is a whole other concept we'll talk about later. But it wasn't really working. Cornmeal was the perfect thing to rely on for many reasons. First, you didn't run into these kinds of issues when you were making some simple cornmeal. Second, if you couldn't grow it because you just didn't live near any regions that had fertile land or were from the places struck by the bowl, then you could buy it for dirt cheap. Third of all, and this is the real kicker, there are actual detailed documents the size of mini novels that show you all the different kinds of recipes you can make with cornmeal. It also really helped that most of these recipes were really easy to make and adaptable to what you had on hand too. Boiled turnip tops were a staple born of necessity, proving that even the green leaves most people might throw away could keep families alive. Turnips were affordable, hardy vegetables that grew well in poor soil, and when their roots were harvested, the greens were never wasted. Women would wash and boil the tops in a simple pot of water, sometimes seasoning only with a pinch of salt if they had it. The greens cooked down into a soft, bitter but nutritious dish that helped fill stomachs when nothing else was available. Occasionally, if there was bacon fat or lard to spare, the leaves would be flavored more richly, but most of the time it was plain boiled greens. Children often disliked the taste, but parents insisted, knowing the vitamins were essential in years when fresh vegetables were rare. For many rural households, boiled turnip tops became a daily food, reminding them of how survival depended on using every single part of the harvest. Gooseberries, on the other hand, were picky. They only flourished in a specific kind of environment, and that was the unforgiving, harsh cold, particularly the kind you'd find near the rocky foothills of the Northeast. They weren't sweet, but while I have been mentioning how some of these fruits were rich in vitamin C, this one is a whole other animal. It's got more of the stuff than an orange, which meant that it was crucial in preventing vitamin deficiencies. It helped keep your autoimmune system strong. And why was this so important? It was because back in those times, even the tiniest of infections could have killed you. Stuff that we'd at best call in sick for or visit the ER for. Still, their benefits weren't all just practical. You could make an incredible pie out of gooseberries. Mixed with some brown sugar or just natural sugars obtained from other fruits, they were a joy. It was especially nice to have them because they were one of the few kinds of fruits that had pie potential while still being able to survive in the cold. For the former, it was a lot more common to forage for fresh berries. Scraping and scavenging what you could find, and, if you were lucky, bringing back a pile big enough to share with the family was a common habit of lower-class or working-class families. Berries were just $2 to $4 per pint back then, and they were mostly imported since a lot of places didn't naturally grow berries. This was especially true for people that lived in big, sprawling cities. All those buildings and subways don't really make for prime berry-growing ground after all. It was more common for rich people to still eat these, though, and they didn't have to spend parts of their day trekking through the muck and woods to scavenge for it either. Not only did they eat berries and buy them regularly, they also used to still buy things like maraschino cherries and enjoy other berry-based dishes that called for heavy use of the fruit. Feeling better about that 9 to 5 yet? I know I'm not. If the idea of cow brain stew makes you squirm, just think about eating it because you had no other choice. Even during the Great Depression, even cow brains were fair game in the fight against hunger. Surprisingly, they weren't just edible. In some circles, they were considered a delicacy. The process of making cow brain stew was meticulous. Brains had to be carefully cleaned to remove any membranes and then gently cooked to avoid an overly rubbery texture. Once seasoned and simmered, the resulting stew had a smooth, creamy consistency that was somewhat comforting. It was silky, almost custard-like, and possibly that's why some people actually liked it. The brain was usually served over rice or potatoes and made one brain into a meal for a family. Cow brain was nutritionally a powerhouse of protein and vitamins and was a valuable food source in lean times. The idea of eating brains didn't exactly have much popularity, and as soon as more appealing options were offered, cow brain stew fell out of favor. Interestingly, in some cultures, eating brain meat was considered a delicacy long before the Depression. For example, certain European and Asian dishes have celebrated cow brains as a prized food item. But as food options became more plentiful and tastes evolved, cow brain stew faded into the background, becoming a curious relic of a time when necessity ruled the dinner plate. These days, cow brain stew is more likely to be a dare than a dinner table. Back then, it was a lifesaver, proving that humans can eat anything, even when the going gets tough. When you're tasked with feeding hungry neighbors during a time when meat was scarce and fresh ingredients were luxuries, creativity was the secret sauce to making a meal memorable. In stepped the tomato aspic salad, a quirky gelatin mold born from pantry staples, which became surprisingly popular at Depression-era potlucks. Home cooks combined tangy tomato juice, often canned or preserved, with economical vegetables like celery, onions, and peppers suspended delicately in gelatin. Since traditional proteins were hard to come by, gelatin provided a sneaky nutritional boost while adding a dash of visual intrigue to the communal table. Housewives cleverly substituted fresh tomatoes with inexpensive canned juice, highlighting how inventive substitutions turned limited pantry stocks into satisfying dishes. This odd yet charming dish embodied the Great Depression's resourcefulness. Each bite was a testament to culinary innovation under pressure. While today gelatin salads might get side eyes at gatherings, in the 1930s presenting a wobbly tomato-flavored mold was both practical and fashionable, an affordable luxury amidst hardship.
Every black kitchen in the 1960s had a jar near the stove, murky and golden, filled with rendered bacon fat that never got thrown away. Your mother poured fresh drippings through a strainer and let them settle like she was making a deposit at the bank. That grease seasoned everything. Cornbread got a spoonful before the batter hit the skillet. Green beans simmered in it for hours. Eggs, fried in it, came out with edges so crisp they shattered at the touch of a fork. During the Second World War, the government collected bacon grease from households because the glycerin could be extracted for explosives, and black families who had been saving drippings for generations just shook their heads. A single jar replaced butter, oil, and half the seasonings in the cabinet, turning the cheapest ingredients into meals that tasted rich. Today, chefs charge extra for dishes finished in animal fat. Your mother never charged a cent. She never owned a measuring cup, not because she could not afford one, but because she did not need one.
When meat was scarce and paychecks had to stretch, dinner often started with one humble ingredient: potatoes. Cheap, filling, and always available, they could be transformed into just about anything. One particularly resourceful creation called potato sizzler involved grating them up, frying them in bacon drippings with a handful of onions, and stirring in a beaten egg to bind it all together. Crisp on the edges, hearty in the middle, and packed with smoky flavor, this simple dish had everything it needed to stand on its own as a meal. Bacon itself wasn't always in the budget, but the drippings? Those were liquid gold. Every working-class kitchen had a can of saved bacon grease sitting on the stovetop, ready to add flavor to whatever was cooking. Onions were another staple, cheap and able to stretch even the simplest dish into something satisfying. The egg, whisked in at the last moment, gave the sizzling potatoes just enough structure to hold together, making the meal feel a little more complete. For families who grew up on it, the smell of potatoes frying in a cast-iron skillet brings back memories of home. When winters were unforgiving and fuel was a luxury, communities during the Great Depression found warmth in numbers, literally. Community bonfires became a resourceful way to conserve fuel while providing heat for multiple families at once. These gatherings became the heart of social bonding in hard times. Neighbors pooled whatever they could find, fallen branches, scraps of wood, or anything that could safely burn, to stoke the flames and keep the cold at bay. Nature itself lent a helping hand in this practice. Rural areas, in particular, relied on the bounty of nearby forests for firewood, while urban neighborhoods made use of discarded pallets or lumber from construction sites. Frugality was the driving force. Why light 10 individual fires when one could do the job for an entire street? Families saved precious resources and, in the process, fostered a sense of camaraderie that made the hardships a little easier to bear. Songs were sung, stories were shared, and for a few hours, the biting cold seemed a little less harsh. Today, this collective effort teaches us the power of community in times of need. And let's face it, sharing a fire is way more fun than huddling solo by a space heater. Mimi's tomato soup cake was an odd one. It used canned stuff like Campbell's tomato soup, which was thriving in the Depression since that whole period really helped put canned products on the map. It also used other things like replacing dairy in the recipe with other substitutes. Despite what you might think, it actually tasted nothing like tomato soup. It was more along the lines of a spice cake, and if I were to make you imagine the flavors, I'd say a good place to start is to picture a mix of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves kind of overtaking the general flavor, but having a dense and impactful kick in their aftertaste. You'd be surprised how many relief organizations like the Red Cross distributed this around too, though I'm still not really sure who Mimi was supposed to be. You'd honestly be surprised with the kinds of things people come up with in a crisis situation. Since meat was so hard to get thanks to all the rationing efforts and the fact that it was just expensive, more than ever before, the way people would make meat last was by adding fillers to it. Things like oatmeal and breadcrumbs were used to stretch a meal out and make sure that it would involve only minimal meat. Most recipes would call for a lot more than what people were using, but that didn't cross their mind once. They were mostly just happy to be including meat at all. Any kind of broth, stew, or casserole, things that the American people are typically used to eating with protein in them, were stretched out using vegetables. Cabbages on the verge of wilting, tomatoes about to spoil, and as much potato as you can fit in one pot. It was things like these that helped people maintain their resources throughout the Depression. It was extremely important to be very intentional with your meat, because people had no other substitute for protein that was as good, but also because of its comfort. Meat was a way for people to restore their spirit and get their mood up, and that's why people would often save it either for celebrations or really bad periods. The Depression also had the benefit of being paired next to some of the worst things to happen in documented human history. I'm talking about ecological terror from the Dust Bowl, back-to-back modern warfare, the likes of which had never been seen in 2 world wars, and mass unemployment. It meant that people had to cut meat out of their lives almost entirely and substitute it with things like lentils and beans. Can you imagine an America where there really is no meat for you to get? Not in the stores, not from your neighbors, not even scraps left at the bottom of a can? It seems like some lucid nightmare that you may have dreamt up after a bender, doesn't it? Yet that was exactly the reality people were living with. Most good or even average cuts of meat had been stored away and rationed for soldiers during the war effort. They vacuumed protein, all those troops. Besides that, the prices for meat in general also skyrocketed beyond belief. Lots of people just weren't in the tax bracket that could afford its own poultry, game, and protein anymore. They adapted in other ways besides lentils and beans, but these natural resources saved dinner time for many people. Cabbage coleslaw proved that absolutely nothing went to waste in the Depression era. While most people today throw away the tough core of a cabbage, thrifty families of the 1930s shaved it finely to make a crunchy salad. With vinegar, a little sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt, it transformed into something tangy and surprisingly refreshing. Carrots or onions, if available, might be added for color and flavor, but often it was just the cabbage core itself. It became a side dish for meals that otherwise would have been too plain or heavy, adding brightness without any real cost. This slaw was a simple reminder that waste was not an option, and even what many considered garbage could become a dish worth serving. Families learned to enjoy the sharp taste and crunchy bite, and for some it even became a regular part of the dinner table. Crab apple is probably not a name you've ever heard of. I wouldn't blame you either. Personally, I find it hard to keep track of my own cousins, let alone fruits. But they actually are wild cousins of your typical apples, and they grow throughout pretty much everywhere. Crab apples don't really look anything like an apple, though. You'll find that in terms of size, they're pretty modest, not really packing much. Your typical grocery store cherry or plum probably has them beat by a few inches. What it lacks in size, it makes up far too much in terms of sourness when you eat them raw. Of course, no one was ever picking these things for cheap, bitter masochism. They made fresh-pressed juice and fermented hard cider out of crab apples. How did they have the idea to take advantage of the fruit's natural acidity? It's beyond me. But crab apples provided a lot of much-needed sustenance to many rural communities. In terms of nutrition, they were pretty much ignorable on their own, though people made a habit of eating their skins for the antioxidants. It's when people would pair them up with other fruits and juices that they would really shine. Some things are meant to have a supporting role, you know. Smoked salmon was even more expensive than the other two we just went over. This is because tenderloin was still something you would find in cattle grown right in the US, and lobster was still something you could fish, but salmon was imported right from Europe or some really niche coastal areas that were cornerstones of the fishing industry but had remote populations and no fine dining culture. A pound of salmon cost $1 to $2, meaning a plate was around $5 to $7 at the best of places and around $2 to $3 at most. New York had places like the Russian Tea Room, which made a big name for itself off of its reputation for serving some of the finest smoked salmon you could find. And of course, rich people flocked like moths to a flame to places like that. For a lot of these people, it's not just the taste, experience, or even the thrill of having a fine premium dish. It's also the status symbol aspect of it all. They get to enjoy and eat what no one can and maintain a lifestyle completely detached from what everyone else is experiencing, and that really gets them going. Lamb's lung and lights may not have been the best thing to don't knock it till you try it, but it was a Depression-era staple nonetheless. The lungs, heart, and liver of a lamb, or in other words, everything the butcher left behind after he took the prime cuts. During hard times, nothing went to waste, not even the parts of the animal most people wouldn't dream of eating today. Boiled and sliced, lamb's lung and lights were sometimes prepared for a hearty stew or fried with onions and spices to hide the gamey flavor. It was nutritionally dense, with iron, protein, and essential vitamins in abundance. The downside? Cooking with the smell was an acquired experience, to put it mildly. This dish had an unappealing reputation, but it was versatile. With potatoes or bread, the organs could stretch to feed large families. It was an act of culinary ingenuity, and while it might sound like something straight out of a horror movie to modern palates, it was an act of culinary ingenuity. Lamb's lung and lights have vanished from most dinner tables, but if you're curious, you might still see it on some adventurous menus or in a distant family recipe book, written in faded ink and a generous dose of nostalgia. Back in the Depression, tossing apple peels in the trash was practically unthinkable. Those scraps were culinary gold for resourceful cooks, who transformed them into apple peel jelly, a clever, sweet treat that stretched household budgets further than a politician's promises. Homemakers combined leftover peels, cores, and even bruised apple bits with water, boiling them into a flavorful liquid before adding sugar and simmering the mixture until it thickened naturally, often without expensive store-bought pectin. Ingeniously, cooks sometimes enhanced this homemade jelly with lemon juice or vinegar as affordable substitutes to mimic pricey commercial preservatives, ensuring it remained fresh and bright-tasting. Apple peels contain natural pectin. Who knew leftovers had built-in magic? So the jelly set beautifully without extra costs. Historically significant beyond simple economy, preserving fruits through homemade jellies allowed families to enjoy essential vitamins and sweetness long after harvest seasons ended. During Depression-era potlucks, bringing jars of this delicate rosy-hued jelly symbolized not poverty, but creativity and pride, turning frugal kitchens into tiny workshops of culinary art.
In black kitchens across the 1960s, washing meat was the first commandment, rooted in West African food traditions that crossed the Atlantic during the slave trade. Enslaved cooks received the least desirable cuts, parts that arrived with odors demanding cleaning before seasoning could begin. Generations later, the ritual held. The lemon cut through slime and the vinegar neutralized bacteria before anyone had a name for it. Your mother rubbed every joint, every cavity, every fold of skin, and if you tried to skip this step, she stopped you cold. It was never just about germs. It was about respect, preparing food with the same care you gave the people eating it. If your kitchen did not smell like vinegar before it smelled like seasoning, you were not from the right kitchen.
Instant coffee meat rub was one of those oddball ideas that somehow worked. You'd mix instant coffee crystals with sugar, salt, and a pinch of flour, rub it on cheap cuts of meat, and throw it in the oven or pan. The coffee acted like a smoky glaze, turning the outside dark and caramelized while hiding the fact that the meat was tough as rubber. It was a poor man's barbecue, full of flavor and pride. Families used it for pork, chicken, or whatever protein happened to be on sale. The smell filled the house like something from a steakhouse, and everyone gathered around pretending it was a special occasion. Even if the meat was chewy, no one complained. The magic of that bittersweet crust fooled everyone into believing it was better than it was. It was one of those small miracles from a time when making dinner meant making do. Crab Louie, also known as the King of Salads, is a classic that originated on the U.S. West Coast in the early 20th century. While its birthplace is up for debate, some say the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, others point to Solari's restaurant in Seattle. It always features Dungeness crab, hard-boiled eggs, asparagus, tomatoes, and a creamy dressing made from mayonnaise, chili sauce, and spices. Crab Louie was dubbed the King of Salads by the San Francisco Chronicle in 1914, a nod to its deluxe ingredients and popularity among the elite. It first gained traction in the 1920s and 1930s, becoming a favored dish for lighter dinners or luncheons. The mix of crisp lettuce, savory crab, and tangy dressing served up in an elegant presentation made it a must-have at many a high-end restaurant and social gathering. In working-class kitchens, the best meals weren't always planned. They were thrown together with whatever was available. A pound of ground beef, a can of tomatoes, some diced potatoes, and a handful of elbow macaroni could turn into a thick, hearty stew that stuck to your ribs and stretched across multiple meals. During the harsh winters of the Great Depression, staying warm often required thinking outside the box, or in this case, inside the fireplace. Families discovered that heating bricks or stones in the fire could turn them into makeshift bed warmers. After wrapping them in cloth, these simple tools provided hours of cozy heat in beds that otherwise felt like ice boxes. It was a brilliant blend of practicality and ingenuity, where people turned something as ordinary as a stone into an essential survival tool. This practice had roots in centuries-old traditions, harking back to a time when central heating was a pipe dream, literally. In a world where every resource counted, even firewood was precious. The choice to heat reusable objects like bricks meant families conserved fuel for other needs, showcasing the relentless frugality that defined this era. A single fire could warm the family and prepare their nighttime comfort. Children were often tasked with fetching the cooled stones from outside, and many families turned the process into a nightly ritual. Today, this simple idea reminds us of the creativity and resilience that emerged in those desperate times. And let's be honest, it's a good thing heated blankets eventually replaced this method, because cuddling a rock just doesn't have the same charm. They called it disgusting because they'd never been hungry enough to know better. Which one proved them wrong for you?